I'm Julie Amos. I'm here at Oxford trying to coordinate all the great projects on war and peace. And today I'm very honoured to have this event with Rama Mani, who's starting a project on the Theatre of Transformation, which is a very energising and interesting project. And so we were lucky to find that at the same moment in time, several people were coming through Oxford that we really wanted to bring to a wider audience. So we have Sahira Kamal from Palestine, who was the first woman secretary of a political party in Palestine, the FIDA party, Palestine Democratic Union, and the first Minister of Women's Affairs in Palestine, and the founder of Women's Studies Center and the Palestine Business Women's Association. And also Sila Elworthy, who I think most of you here know as well, who is the founder of the Oxford Research Group, the founder of Peace Direct, and has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 3 times, and also is a laureate of the Nirvana Peace Prize, and a councillor of World Future Council, and the co-founder of Rising Women, Rising World, and also an advisor to the elders, which I think most of you know as well. We've got Rama Mani, who's joining us today, and she's the founder of the Theatre of Transformation Academy and the convener of this project, which is called Enacting Global Transformation. And she's also a councillor of the World Future Council and a co-founder of the Rising Women, Rising World. Now, the idea here today is to kind of have a very collaborative event. And so towards the end, we're going to have some pieces of paper where people can, if they're not comfortable speaking up, they can write down their thoughts and questions and so on. We're going to have some very personal testimonies. As you can see, we've tried to break up the room a little bit and so on. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Sila first. Is that right? Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I had 4 big, strong elder brothers, faster and more able than I was. And when I was 11, they taught me how to fire with a shotgun. I thought I was extremely clever. And in my hubris, I went into the woods and I did something absolutely taboo. I stood underneath a tree. I pointed the gun upwards at the nest of a bird. And I pulled the trigger. Down on my head came pieces of stick, pieces of eggshell, egg yolk, and the tiny embryos of chicks, as well as the sky blue feathers of the mother bird. And I was so shocked by what I'd done that I took the gun home and put it away and never touched it again. This was my lesson in the extent of my 11-year-old girl's violence. And it was really this that propelled me, this feeling of a horror of what people can do to people, let alone to animals, that propelled me into trying to stop people killing each other in some way or another. I found myself in 1982 at the United Nations at their 2nd special conference on nuclear disarmament. After 6 weeks, not one agreement had been reached. And I was not just shocked, but I was broken-hearted. And I was struck hanging on a tram on Broadway, and I suddenly thought, talking to the wrong people. You need to find out who makes the decisions on nuclear weapons, and where and how, and talk to them. So, packed up what I was doing in New York, came home, started a research group around my kitchen table. Kitchen table's the best place to start a research group. And in 4 years, we published our first book, How Nuclear Weapons Decisions Are Made, with Macmillan. And a couple of years later, a who's who with biographies of 650 nuclear weapons decision makers in all the then nuclear nations, including China, because we wanted to render the process accountable. And I mention this story because what this led us to understand was that the best way to transform violence in whatever way we conceive it, I say, is through dialogue. Now, in the early 1980s, nobody was really using the word dialogue at all. Now it's the byword of most civil society organizations, is dialogue. So we had to learn how to do it. And it became the methodology of choice now for most active NGOs. And it involves very feminine skills. Now, when I say feminine, I mean those available equally to men as to women. But one of those skills is listening. Ask anybody if they're a good listener, and they'll say, oh yes, certainly I am. Most are not. When you check it out in a 40-minute exercise, to actually see how we do listen to one another. And I found that really giving somebody my full attention, to the extent that I can remember not only what they said, but what the feelings were behind what they said, is the first way to begin the process of unraveling violent conflict. And I've got hundreds of examples. Just one that I'll quickly mention. And that's in northwest Pakistan, where Gululai Ismail, aged 15, started getting girls into school. Now, her colleague, Malala Yousafzai, was shot in the head for doing that, and you remember that story. Gululai went on undeterred, getting girls into school. She's now 26, and she's now trained 250 young people to go into the madrasas, to find the young men who are being trained to be jihadis, to go home with them to their families and discuss with them why the Quran would not approve of suicide bombing. They have deterred 203 suicide bombers who are no longer intending on that kind of jihad. Now, they did that by listening and talking quietly. They didn't do it by bombing them. The big threats that we now all face in the world cannot be deterred in any way by weaponry. Those big threats are global warming, terrorism, obviously, overpopulation, migration, the rich-poor gap, which is fueling migration, and lastly, the cyber attacks that we've experienced so recently in the UK. Weapons are useless against any of these, and yet we keep piling budget upon budget of billions of dollars, pounds, and every kind of currency into weaponry. This has to change. And when we talk about transformation, it's transformation at this level of what we're investing in. I've recently begun a piece of research for a book that will be published shortly on what it actually costs to prevent war at local level, national level, and international level. And what is emerging is that it is less than a fraction of 1% of what we currently spend on weaponry. We know how to stop people killing each other. We know the methods that work. We've evaluated them. And just let me give you one example of the extent of that. In 1999, we did a piece of research to understand and measure how many locally led peace initiatives there are in the world that are effective and accountable. And there were 350, and we wrote a book about 50 of them. That was in 1999. We did the same piece of research last year, and there are now 1,488 such organizations. This is a phenomenon, a bottom-up phenomenon, and I want to stress that most of us have been trained to think that peace comes from the top down, by negotiations, by high-level agreements, and so on. I am positing that the really interesting and exciting phenomenon now is grassroots shoots coming up through the concrete of war. And this is what is going to affect the change and the transformation that all of us are talking about. And I'll conclude, because Rama asked me to talk about what's my vision for the world, a world without war. And I would take my cue from Nelson Mandela. What he did when he was released from jail in 1989, he realized the imminence of civil war in South Africa. Weapons were being showered upon the ANC, millions of dollars available to them. And I lived there for 10 years and I knew that civil war was imminent. And so, of course, did Mandela much better than I. He organized the national and local peace councils. Now this might sound normal and boring, but it was absolutely electric. The National Peace Council was composed of people who were trusted by the whole nation, as in each city, each province, and right down to village level. And the job of those peace councils was to develop a peace policy, a peace program for their area. That means that when violence erupted, they knew how to move in and stop it. Like, for example, necklacing in the townships. You all know what necklacing was? A tire was put round the head of somebody who was thought to be an informer. Petrol was poured into it and lit. They trained, particularly women, to go in and stop necklacing. So they stopped the spark of armed and violent conflict before it started, because very often those fights developed into full-scale area scuffles. And often many people were killed. So this methodology that Mandela set up was effective in not only reducing but actually preventing civil war in South Africa. That policy is now called Infrastructure for Peace. It's been mandated by law in Kenya and Nigeria. And this methodology, I feel, should be extended to every country at risk of conflict. It costs only $500,000 to set it up, and $500,000 every year to continue the trainings, and $2 million to set it up. Nothing compared to the destruction of what would happen, even if small wars broke out, small conflicts. So this is just one of the methodologies, and I've outlined 29 of them now that actually work and are effective, and we can cost them and evaluate them to bring about peace. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here with the Theatre of Transformation and to evoke from all of those of you listening and active here and hear from you what you plan to do. Because none of us are being shot at, none of us are being bombed, we're all educated, we've got enough to eat, and we've got a roof over our head. So if not us, who? And if not now, when? Thank you.
That's great. I'm going to hand over directly to Zahira.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sila. And thank you, Rama, for giving me this opportunity to be here and talking to people in this stage, and perhaps also who are participating with us through the media. Actually, as you know, I'm Palestinian, Zahira Kamal, General Secretary of FIDA Party, and I'm a social, political activist. My background is physics and chemistry. And I used to teach physics in a teacher training college that all of its students are refugees. They are refugees since 1948, according to the establishment of Israel on the land of the Palestinian people, of which there was like 100 villages were destroyed totally, and they were immigrated by force from their land. So for me, I'm from Jerusalem. I was not in any of the camps. I didn't know about their suffering, but teaching them And a part of our work, it is visiting them in their places, in the camps. So I came to know the life of women in the camps. And here I came to think how we can make the change. Of course, power, I'm familiar with power because as a teacher of physics, it's widely used in physics. And in politics, it is also widely used in politics. In physics, it is that we are talking about how we can accumulate the individual units in order to maximize the outcome of that power. So, in politics, we are talking about controlling people and the land and the resources. So, how we can face that? How this terminology, power, is very rarely used in social sciences. It is not. We are talking about the power over, but not talking about the power in and the power within. So here is my turning point to think about these women. I start reading about psychology and sociology and all that, but at the same time, I know very well that one hand cannot collapse. We have to work together. So with with some of my colleagues, 25 women, we came together to start the first grassroots organization. It's Women Action Committee, and it was established on 1978. We start walking out, going from one camp to the other, from one village to the other, trying to talk with women, with their families, to recognize their problems and to define their priorities and how they can help themselves to change the paradigm they are in. And of course, to give them some support to what they decide. It is not that we are doing the work on behalf of them. They decide what they want to do, and with our social relations, with our international relations, we can help them. So, we find that this is not a destiny of women to live the same way that they are. We are living under occupation, 50 years of occupation of the whole Palestine, and it is we are living in a tribal, patriarchal society. At that time, I'm talking on the 70s, early marriage. Most of women, perhaps you can see more than half of the women, they are married before the age of 17. And they have a high fertility rate, 10 children per woman. Very low participation in the working in work. So there are only 6% of the working power are women. Very low education, 18% of women only they can read and write. So this has, through the work that we did, a big change has happened. First of all, women are exceeding now the number of men in all stages of education. The illiteracy is only 2%. Fertility rate drops down to 4.9 child to per woman. Work raised to 19%. So we can make a change. And it is not by force, it's not by violence, it is by, first of all, to help women know the strong points that they have, to build their confidence of themselves, and to help them working together, because it is not possible to make a change in your society without working with the other. And to motivate yourself. It is not, okay, I understand what are the problems, we can talk together, but if we are not moving together, we cannot make the change. It is, we have to move together, we have to raise their voice and to learn how to tackle our challenges and to see where to direct our motivation. The other thing, it is with occupation. Occupation is controlling us with weapons, with violence, and so on. I'm coming now from participating in a solidarity campaign with prisoners. 1,700 prisoners are holding a hunger strike because they want their human rights, their rights in prison for education, for the respect of the dignity of their families when they are coming to visit them, and they are depending only on water and salt. And they have one slogan, says, water and salt equals dignity. And people around, they are supporting them. And we find that even on the international community, there is a big support to these rights. So here it's a different way of using the power. And to, if we are talking about what can, the future and how we can make the change. First of all, I can say that respecting the human rights. Human rights, it's not for persons that they are white, or for a special religion, or for rich people. It should be for all people, despite of all these kind of things. The second thing, it is about to respect the dignity of all people. All of us, we have dignity, and we want everybody to respect that. To respect the diversity between us. We are not similar. And perhaps the unsimilarity of us is flowering our world. It's much better to have a different ways of thinking, different personalities, and if we are accumulating what we have all together, we can have much better world than if we are very similar and we are duplicating ourselves. The other thing, it is we can bring peace without having wars. It is to have all rights for everybody, and to be transparent, and also if there is someone wrong, to say that's wrong. And here I came that there is an international responsibility for the cause that is happening in Palestine, the Palestinian cause, because everybody is keeping silent about the violation of human rights that it is done by Israel, and the wars that Israel is holding against Palestinians in Gaza and in other places. So I think if we are accountable to what we are saying, then we can make a change. And I can say that we can make a change with ideas and ideas. It is not only by wars and violence. Thank you.
That's wonderful, thank you. Now we're going to move to a very special segment of this presentation, which is Rama, who brings testimonies not just of herself, but also of other people who have been transformed in various ways to do with peace and conflict resolution. So I'm going to hand over to Rama.
Thank you. I'll see if this mic works.
Yes,
Does it
yes.
seem to? Yes, wonderful. Thank you. And it's been such a joy for Julia and myself to have our beautiful collaboration to avail of the fact that the two of you could be in Oxford today. And I'm also really thrilled that we could collaborate this way between CIS, War and Peace Studies at Oxford, OxPeace, the Academy, Rising Women, Rising World, but also via live stream with our partners, We World Academy, based in Canada, but with a network around the world, very active in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, thanks to Dr. Annie Lim, and with Jocelyn Mersado, who's based in the US, but also has a vast network of people across the US and elsewhere. So thanks to you all, and also for the patience in putting up with our technological challenges and those who supported us in making that happen. For me, before I jump into my storytelling, what I want to say is right between Julia and me sit two of the women, and in front of me sits the third woman of the four who've been, I would say, like the godmothers at turning points of my own journey of transformation. I grew up in India, and I became passionately obsessed with, like you, power. And I was not a physicist or a chemist. It was simply, how could it be possible that this thing called power could be so abused? And those who seem to have the kind of power you were describing, this inner power, this luminous capacity that you described ever since your childhood of wanting to do things differently through dialogue and inclusion, how come they were the ones excluded? The women, the lower caste, those who seem to have the wisdom and the visions and the values, the ideals you spoke about, and instead we had political power, religious power, social power, and power within the family that was so abused. So that became my quest to question the existing paradigms of power and see how we could redefine them. How could those who actually had human power become those who we follow, listen, and who guide us? And that's why the friendship, collaboration with Scylla became so important. I think we first met in the early 2000s, and the ways in which I've been inspired by how Scylla radiates this inner power and creates this space of listening, of deep value-based listening, from which the solutions arise when there is the most profound crisis, as you've yourself said so often, indeed, a civil war breaking out. Seeing how Calypso, you have within the academic institutions here in the University of Oxford shown how the pursuit of knowledge can be a way of completely expanding, questioning, redefining what power is, which is, after all, the heart of politics and international relations, and encouraging your students to do so at all levels. But finally, it was meeting this extraordinary lady that became a turning point. Zahira, I think I first contacted you in 2004, but it was after 2011 with the Foundation for the Future that our friendship and collaboration started, and your insistence that I come to Palestine now. And I remember that photograph was actually in one of our first meetings in the FIDA office with the Women's Action Committee. And so I want to take us there because it was then, in that bridge between leaving Palestine in 2013 landing at a meeting that Calypso and myself and Scylla, I can't remember if Julia, you were with us at that particular meeting in December 2013, of women scholars, that I accidentally discovered the power of what you started with, Julia, the power of our own testimonies, the power of our stories that guide our lives and enable us to step into the power of our stories, but more importantly, like you've just shown, rewrite our own story and thereby the story of our societies. Become the actors, the script writers of a different possible future, which is what you two have done. So with that, I wanted to actually share a couple of the stories that have powerfully moved me, starting with Palestine, where this journey began. I am Intisar. My name means freedom. My mother wanted to call me Amal. Amal means hope. But my father said, no, freedom, Intisar. I want nothing less than freedom. I'm glad he won that argument. My brother, my older brother, he became a peace activist and a freedom fighter when he was very young. When he was 17, he was arrested in front of our eyes. Every time I would travel with my mother and my sisters, the long journey to visit him in prison, I would dream of becoming a freedom fighter myself. So I too joined a political party and became politically active in fighting for freedom. My parents tried to marry me off when I was 17, but I said no. I resisted, and I only got married when I was 21 after my studies. My husband did not like my political activism. He even threatened to divorce me, but I kept on. Even my family did not like it. But finally, my family and my husband's family accepted that it was important for a woman to make up her own mind and to be politically active. I joined the Women's Action Committee, started by Zahira and the women leaders of our country. My work is with young, very young women and men. I help them to become politically conscious, to get politically involved. I help them to form their own ideas about our society. Because my dream is freedom, but freedom where young people are not just thinking about their studies, not just thinking up to how to forward their own life, but they are involved in politics to shape our future together. This is my dream of freedom. I am Munira from Afghanistan. My father was a Pashtun. My mother was a Hazara. But I am just Afghan. My father was a Mujahideen. He fought for the freedom of our country. For that reason, our lives were very dangerous, and we had to leave and become refugees in Iran. It was not easy to live as refugees. I think that's why I became a poet and an artist. That, and because every night our mother would tell us stories about Afghanistan, how it was the most beautiful country in the world. So I would dream of the day we would return to our country and all the things I could do there. So after the Taliban left, we returned to Afghanistan. But when I arrived there, I couldn't believe my eyes. This ruin, everything broken down, bombed out. This was the paradise my mother told me about. I was so depressed. For 2 years, I had no idea what to do with my life. I felt I had nothing left to give. Then slowly, from that darkness, a vision started arising again. I had come back to help my country. There were 3 things I loved in life: my values, my ethics, my people and culture, and my art. So I joined the government. I joined the Ministry of Internal Governance, because with this job, I get to go around the country to different provinces. I get to speak to people, ordinary people, and I ask them, how did the war affect you? What happened to you? And now, what are your wishes? What can the government do to support you and your community? And I take what they say back to my minister, and we use that to shape our policies. But I haven't stopped being an artist. We've created a women's artist collective. We share our artwork, our poetry, our paintings, and we have exhibitions to invite the public. My favorite project is in the streets of Kabul, with the street children, more and more every day. I go to the street children and I ask them, what is your name? What is your dream? Then I give them paper and colors, and they paint their dream. I don't want their future to be like the future of the Taliban. I don't want our country's future to be like our past. I am Noura. I am from Homs in Syria. Our parents taught us from the time we were very small that the most important thing in our lives are our values. They taught us to love justice and to fight for justice whatever the consequences. They taught us to value freedom. They prepared us for what we are doing now. Already in university, we students organized ourselves to resist the Baath Party, but they crushed our revolution. But then our revolution started all over the country, and we all joined in together, whatever our background. 10 times they have arrested me. The first time, they detained me and interrogated me for hours. But you know what? After that first time, my courage grew. I was not afraid of anything anymore. 2 times they put me in jail, but we showed them. Inside Homs jail, we organized a strike, a revolution. They surrounded the jail with snipers and tanks, but we kept resisting. We showed them, you can imprison our bodies, but never our minds. We would rather die free than be your slaves. They punished us. They burnt my parents' home. They arrested not just me, but my brother and sister. They tortured us. My sister, in 70 days, they destroyed her. She's in and out of jail, of hospital, but we know she'll never be the same again. But I'm small and slim, but I'm strong inside. I will never stop fighting for our freedom, for our values, because I am not afraid to die for freedom. Thank you. Well, with that, I believe we would love to open up and ask you what it is for you that power, freedom, and the values that could define a new paradigm of power might be. I definitely know that it was these three godmothers, as I call them, the fourth being Jean Houston, our co-founder of Rising Women, Rising World, that led me to use the power of stories to begin to investigate both how have people, women of course, but also men, young people, old people, taken their lives in their own hands and begun a different story in their lives, in their societies. And what I found the most exciting is the possibility of really beginning to redefine this collectively, so we can, at this moment of turmoil, begin to see how we might bring about systemic change and a real redefinition of the paradigm of power. So back to you, Julia.
Thank you.
I'm absolutely certain that women in war, they do not belong to one and the same word. And well, I'm not ready to tell any story now, but I will try to share with you the story of which I still have to think. And I will tell you who I am, of course, yes. I teach philosophy in Moscow National Research University, and here I'm on fellowship at Department of Politics and International Relations, and my research is related to peace and war.
Mm-hmm.
So for me it is, in fact, I feel some kind of dissatisfaction now when I do research, philosophical research on war. There is a kind of discrepancy, I feel, emotionally. The rational level and the emotion level of thinking and feeling the matters of war and peace, they do not really correspond. There is a discrepancy. Probably the discrepancy arises from the fact that our rational side, the rational side which is responsible for philosophy, do not really correspond something deeper, do not really correspond the emotions.
Yeah.
And in philosophy, what is taking place in philosophy now, we have this crazy just war theory now, you may be familiar with, and this theory is in fact embraces and in fact it pushes out all other possible approaches to war. Nobody speaks of pacifism nowadays because, well, philosophers already proved that it is logically invalid, that it doesn't belong to our contemporary world of logic and reason. You may read some of the articles of the contemporary philosophers who proved that pacifism do not really belong to reason. I don't remember the name, but maybe I will tell you the famous article of this Canadian philosopher, who is my friend, by the way. But anyway, when it comes to the combination of terms such as women, war, and peace, the things which emerge in my imagination is, of course, the great novel by Tolstoy. Tolstoy was not much of a philosopher. He may be even ridiculed in terms of Western rational philosophy, because his philosophy is not very rational to the Western terms. But when you read Tolstoy, you really come to understand what is war and what is peace. Maybe it may not be put that evidently and vividly in rational terms, but you feel disgust to war. And you feel disgust to some major figures of war, some major figures who we claim to be the great people, like Napoleon. Napoleon is, in Tolstoy's great novel, is simply a puppet. Is simply a nincompoop who is moved by the great storm of the great flood of people, and that our people really matter. These are people who really matter, according to Tolstoy. We may disagree with his philosophy, but you cannot help feeling that. that people is something which really matters. People may also be mistaken. People may also be embraced by some stupid feelings, imagination, but at least that is, we have to understand. We have to understand what is coming from people. So in my research, I'm trying to find the links with peace, so that war may be a little bit at least set down. Because in the contemporary just war theory, what I can feel is that war is adopting even more dangerous and threatening modes. In the contemporary just war theory, some new concepts arise which threatens me. The concepts, for example, as supreme emergence. The concept of supreme emergence allows us simply to delete or to push away all the constraints which we usually have when we go traditionally, when we used to go to war in the past. The concept of humanitarian intervention, the crazy idea that we may kill a number of people so that to save the rest of the people, or the concept of preventive war. If we stick to this and some other new concept in just war theory, I'm afraid we are adopting a new, very threatening mode of war, which Clausewitz already described as absolute war. For Clausewitz, it was logically impossible, or it was only logically possible, absolute war.
May I ask you a question?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm fascinated by your analysis.
Just give me the mic.
No,
Sorry.
it's okay, I'm
Just
sure
for-
they can hear me. No?
Just for the camera, I think, and the
I'm so interested in the philosophical dialogues that you hold. What is considered to be the antidote to war? What is considered to be, if pacifism is beyond the bounds of reason, philosophy, as I understand it, always wants to look at the other side. What's the counterbalance? What's the antidote? Can you tell me, this is a very, very genuine inquiry on my part. What is considered in modern philosophy the antidote to war?
I'm really confused by your question. I do not see any, unfortunately. I do not see any. When I started this research on just war theory, which was about 10 years ago, I thought that that is an antidote. Because in just war theory, at least as I understood it, it was 10 years ago when I started to get interest in this theory. A number of constraints. So ideally, if you take all these constraints, like constraints of use in bello, constraints of use at bellum, which is proportionality, discrimination, and so on and so forth, including just cause, right intentions. So ideally, there would be no war, because if you really put all these principles at work, no war can ever emerge if you really stick to these principles. But unfortunately, what I see now in the contemporary just war theory, it is the other way around, so that these principles are used for the special purpose to justify war.
It's justify war,
Yeah,
not
not
justify.
to-
The way to
yes.
justify
Not to
war,
prevent it.
Not to prevent.
Yeah, and
Not,
that's why the word
Yeah.
war remains.
yes.
There isn't another word which is considered philosophically to be the other side, the antidote, the quid pro quo.
Can I?
Yes.
Yeah.
please.
I'm ashamed to tell you that I do not see that.
I'm really
Thank you so
grateful to you
much.
for your
Thank
research. It's most interesting, really.
I think so. Here at Oxford, we're lucky to have Cheney Ryan, who does write on pacifism, I mean, the problem with pacifism was that it was very hinged on kind of nation to nation kind of conflict, and that's the sort of conflicts that we have been moving away from. I mean, now conflict is often intranational within parties in a country, or between state.
Asymmetric.
Yeah, it can be transnational in the sense that it can be between a state and some other place and non-state actors within, for example, Afghanistan and so on. So so it's very much shaping how we approach war. But I think that the tools that we have at hand are from a previous era in a way, and I think there's a reason for that. I think that focus, as you say, leads to justifications for being able to pursue these things. If you look at more of a kind of paradigm of policing, that sort of thing, like you say, things that we know that works in preventing violence, because ultimately how we define war is usually done in terms of casualties in a political conflict. Yeah, but that's only telling us that a political situation has gotten so bad that it's reached a certain magnitude. But ultimately, these different political situations that have been allowed to get that bad are very different. And so the solutions may in fact not lie in looking at it as if it was the same, but entirely the other way around, as if those are political situations that are so bad that they perhaps need a package of different solutions that are very different. That's
With you there.
okay. Shall I hand over to Calypso?
If you could come up front and then. Yes. Wonderful. That's lovely.
What do you want me?
Wherever. Yes. There we go. That's
Follow
lovely.
Rama's. Yeah, I first of all would like to join Rama and all of you in thanking each other, really, and feeling that we are advancing together in trying to think from our own experiences and all the experiences that we've had shared with us, either in this amazing way in which Rama collects stories and then translates them for the rest of the world, or the ways in which Zahira and Sila share their own experience, activists and speaking to the world, and Julia in her scholarly way, and everyone else in this room. And in fact, I think that the topics that we're discussing today, women, war, and a new paradigm of power, is clearly very much at the heart of the approach of theater of transformation, which we've been so proud and committed to supporting here in this department, supporting its launch, and progressively, is our hope, bring students and faculty together around the vision that Rama has put forward, because it speaks to start with to a notion of power which ranges from persuasion, from what's in our mind, and the images and stories we have in our mind, all the way to action, and action which can be at the very macro level or in international institutions, all the way to our localities and our villages, and all the stories that Zahira was sharing with us in Palestine, and Sila kind of anywhere in between the very macro and the very micro, and all of us there. So the first point I wanted to make is, because in part we are also here trying to put forward a research agenda and a thinking agenda. What are we going to do in the next years with this project together, and each in our own realm? So I think thinking about how power ranges from action to persuasion will be very important to us, because of course our students, what we do in a university is about ideas and persuasion, but then we have students who write thesis and they go on the field and they do things and they act, and they of course you could say that words are action, and we could have a long conversation where it's about all of this. So there is a question about thinking about power. But then we were just having a conversation about war. And I was thinking of how we are talking about war here. and about the fact that there are two kind of opposite warnings, as it were, for us. One is, we often talk with our students about concept stretching, and be careful with concept stretching, because we don't really want to go the road of the war on terror, the war on drugs. You know, everything becomes a war on something in this world, and if we want to sell something, we call it war on X. So, and we understand that this is a certain kind of manipulation. There's a certain political reasons why things are called war on, as opposed to police, as opposed to defense, as opposed to other things. So we don't want to do that. But at the same time, I don't think we're only speaking about war zone and tanks and cannons. We're talking about all sorts of different contexts of wars and dimensions of war, and the before and the after, and a world at war, and a world at war with itself. So in a way, we're guilty of even greater concept stretching than those we don't really like when they do, you know, war on terror. So this is just a question, because all we're doing today really is asking questions to each other. And I want to ask us, you know, what are we talking about with war? And so the third point then becomes, to pick up on Julia and on Boris, I would like to do some concept stretching by saying that I think people who do international, scholars who get involved in international relations, are more often than not motivated by preventing war. And it's not just peace studies. We've had lots of discussions, including in this room, on the fact that, you know, if you try to understand the causes of war, if you try to understand why and how nations cooperate or fail to cooperate, what game theory, you know, matrix gives us versus what and some other theory will give us, we're all trying to understand what are the underlying factors which create war, and therefore how at the end of the day we can think about how you prevent war. So in a way, my definition of international relations as a field is about war prevention. And I don't think, you know, realists like Waltz or whatever, the neo-realist school, are a bunch of people who only just want to do war. They predict that this world is very war-prone. Institutionalists will tell you, no, institutions help mitigate that. But I don't think that a scholar who stands there and says, well, war is around the corner, likes the prediction necessarily. So again, there are very realist scholars who really, you know, worried about war, and that's their, you know, calling. So I would like to kind of, you know, extend the field, as it were, since this is where we're doing this in DPIR, to say, that's how I understand. Now, this being said then, we get to Sila's point about prevention and how we do prevention. That's the practice of prevention, so rather than just defining IR as a field where we think about how to prevent. Concretely, you're all talking about actors who are trying to prevent conflict, war, or most often the recurrence of conflict, because we do know that the biggest predictor, the best predictor of conflict and war is a past war. That's, you know, we've done many regressions and we know that's the predictor. And of course, you know, one question I do have for you, Sila, because you persuasively and brilliantly, you know, tell us about all of these groups that are supported and learn from each other at the micro level and do work that indeed does prevent the recurrence of conflict. But I think you're right also that by saying that the powers that be, whether international institutions, governments, corporations, and all those who have money and resources, are not attuned to prevention in the social realm, because we know how to measure the benefit of prevention when we develop a vaccine, because we have a curve and then it goes down. We can measure exactly the cost of non-prevention. But it's very, very hard in the social world to measure what didn't happen and to convince people. And with our conversation we have recurrently in the United Nations, where the budgets for conflict prevention go down and down and down, because how do you sell it? You know, well, 10 years ago you spent this and this didn't happen. How do you demonstrate? And you don't have a nice curve that there was that amount of disease and then it went down. You can't do this with what we're talking about. So I think one of the questions we should address, and I have for you, is how do we think about prevention? And finally, I just simply wanted to illustrate what I was saying about how here in the DPIR, I think our students contribute to thinking about war and conflict and prevention in their own ways, ranging and just giving some examples, because I think it's important to share. So Boris was telling us about Clausewitz and absolute war, and so we start with the notion that theories, concepts, have been used for hundreds and hundreds of years, especially in the development of international law, and to justify war as well as constrain it. To call it just, but then to say we have law of war so that we don't maim each other. And so indeed, part of what we should do as scholars is deconstruct the stretching of just war to encompass more and more actions, as well as the allowance for going beyond these kinds of, the kind of theories used in bello, the kind of laws of wars that are trying to say, well, there are things you can do and things you can't do. One of our students has worked on the concept of enemies of mankind, for instance, Claire Vergerio, which was invented by Gentili 400 years ago, and is still justified to do certain things to people who don't fall within the normal realm of wars conducted by sovereign states. And that kind of seems to allow for anything and everything. So there is a conversation that Boris brilliantly started us with about concepts. But then, of course, we become more and more concrete, and there are, of course, there are students who work on how regional cooperation can create communities, security communities that little by little develop cultures at different levels of trusting each other. There are those who talk about, who've been on the field working with refugees, to think about how the ways in which we work with refugees today will help us rebuild their country tomorrow, something we all share very much. And your stories on Syria, Rama, were all about this, and obviously, Zahira, that's what your kind of life is about. And development in war zone, colleagues and students working on the ways in which peace building prepares the long term, or the ways in which civil wars can be predicted as a function of political polarization. We have people here working on cyber and the whole world of the internet and how that impacts the likelihood of war. And we have others who work on nuclear disarmament, very much Sila's life. And there are fascinating things happening as we speak right now in New York. The humanitarian initiative, which I think will deserve much, much more attention from all of us, in the future. Some of our students are working on this. And then we have, of course, collaborators who are not necessarily in the academia or writing PhDs, but who come to us with their amazing experience on the field. And one of them is here with us today, Ezgi, who was a journalist was intently, a journalist with Radical in Turkey, and who's had to flee her countries for reasons we're all very familiar with, but who has paid the price for being too interested in the war with the Kurds. This is an internal war, talking about civil war, and sometimes in many countries journalists pay very, very high price. We're glad you were able to come to us, Ezgi, today, and in the last few months and years. And if you would like to share your story, that would be wonderful. But you are also an example of someone who's thinking very, very hard about the pathologies of war, but ultimately how to prevent war in the future in your part of the world. So I just wanted to share all these stories with you because I believe that this is very much a moment and a beginning, and this is all about the conversation between actors in the field and us in the academia, a conversation that should go on and on and on.
Thank you.
Tacking on to that, I want to say, so our title here today was Women, War and a New Paradigm of Power. And I was thinking, I was struck actually when Zahira was talking about power, what is power, and how power is very much setting the agenda, what's on the agenda, who gets to decide what the problem is, if it's war or if it's a policing problem, and so on, and the way that you enabled local women to take control over their own agenda and set their own agenda and ask them, you know, what would you like to identify as the problems? And I think at this time, because what's special about our time now is that there's a great deal of change, and there's people who would like to take that change in one direction, who would like to make that look inevitable, I would say. And I think it's up to all of us perhaps to try and actively think about, well, this isn't how it looks to me. And to put forward what we see with honesty. You talked about integrity. And then that's a really brave thing. That came out in Rama's testimony as well, really strongly, because that could be very transformative. You know, the emperor is naked. There is a war going on. Let's try and discuss it. And I was wondering, do you feel comfortable talking?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Calypso, for when listening to all of you. When listening to all of you.
Microphone.
Near your mouth.
Yeah.
Okay. When listening to all of you, I realized that what I've been doing since 19 years of age is actually telling the stories. I'm a journalist, and what I do best is what Rama is doing, really. Only I do it with my writing. And the reason I ended up here is my perseverance of telling the story of what really happened to the Kurds of Turkey, how the peace process had collapsed, and how it could have not collapsed, which was really crucial. So when you say, Sila, that we really need grassroots, but we actually have to reveal what those top level people are doing and not doing, which is really important. So and you say the feminine skill of listening. When I look at the media landscape of my country, I realize that the bravest and journalists are usually women. Women usually women journalists tend to go into these unpopular fields and try to voice the persecuted. So it is really important, and I think the best interviews and best storytelling comes out from women journalists. And well, I may be a little biased here, but so what I like to say is that we need to find new collaborative models with you people and with my people, which are journalists, to reveal, also tell the story like Rama did, and because we can make a difference. We can actually, for example, we as journalists are about to impeach the worst president of the United States. So we do have the power to do those things. We need to find new collaborative models. That's what I think.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to say thank you for speaking, because I know that you've personally been under threat.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
I've been, no, but I mean, and I think it brings us back a little bit to what Boris was saying about just war. That you have these very high-minded philosophical models which tries to postulate in which cases is it okay to kill and so on. But then once people get once they're really existentially threatened, that emotional thing happens and it becomes much more complicated. So.
Thank you very much.
This side is also quite good for the camera.
Oh
well,
which
whatever.
side? So maybe I do half of the speech here and the other one I do here. But first of all, I was delighted to listen to all of you, and of course I have the pleasure to regularly witness the performances of my wife Rama and of friends like Sahira and Sila, and now also Julia. But I wanted to say the trigger for me was very much, how do we build more collaborative frameworks actually. And the one thing that I take actually from what I heard and saw from the four of you was very much actually terms like inclusion, terms like working with diversity, terms like actually more forward-looking in a way like how do we rebuild society, peace as a proactive process to rebuild or build society, rather than often the focus on war and conflict prevention, which is very much about, well, how do we avoid something that happened, which is absolutely necessary, but equally important is the more other-oriented process of peace building. Now, I come actually just from Iceland, and there's something I witnessed for the first time in my life, that I heard the president of a society, it's a tiny one, as you all know, opening a conference. And he talked about the responsibility of his society to the world. He didn't just talk about what they do in Iceland, but actually it was an other-oriented process of politics. What is the active contribution of Iceland to the world, which was in relation to peace, in relation to sustainable development. I found it powerful, and I was thinking to myself, what if every society had a vision for the world, and not just for itself, you know? I come first, which is very self-centered, what we witness. So what is the other-centered equivalent we equally need? That's one thing. Last month I was in Palestine with Sahira, and we sat there with 30 young people, transformation agents, thinking what is, among many questions, what is the gift of Palestine to the world? Because of course everyone looks on the struggle, but they said, well, the gift, two things, hope, what they expressed, and the ability of building a peaceful society in the midst of struggle and oppression. Of course it's a never-ending process so far, and many people lose illusion, and yet that's what they feel is something they see Palestine bringing to the world. And back to their point of collaborative processes. Because what we witness today, I would like to make an attempt to connect what I heard. Because I do hear a politician speaking, Suzahira. I hear a researcher activist, Silla, speaking. I hear another researcher activist speaking. I hear someone who was a researcher activist but who is now also evoking the power of story, of the narrative. And in a way I see this as a missing part. And of course, Calypso, listening to you and your passion, what you do with your students here in rebuilding society, I look for new ways, and that's actually at the heart of my work as well. How do we bring these different stakeholders in societies in a whole new way together to create solutions? I believe university has an important role to play as a kind of, how to say, space where these different, which can convene the different stakeholders of societies and engage them not just in workshops, but in long-term processes, which we need for what we are doing. Hence, actually, my question to you is how do we see these different dimensions? And of course, economics is missing today as a major force also for conflict and war. How do we see these different stakeholders that you to a degree represent working in a more collaborative way together to build societies, of course also to prevent conflict and war, but to build peaceful societies? And that is my question and my inspiration that I take from all of you today. Thank you.
I would love to take up Alexander's challenge and Calypso's, because in terms of the contribution of an institution like Oxford University and the kind of research that can come out of this, I would love to take your title, but particularly the question of how do we correlate women's leadership with peaceful society. Now, there are very good starting points on this. The Scandinavian countries, for example,
Iceland,
where women have been in leadership positions for much longer, and the countries haven't been at war. Iceland, obviously. But more remarkably, in the question of what's been happening in West Africa, where women actually stopped civil wars and now are building peaceful societies. I'm struck by the story of the Rojava women, which you must be very familiar with. And these are armed, trained recruits to the army of Rojava, but they went into the Yazidi territory and rescued hundreds, if not more, over 1,000 Yazidi women and children. And if I understand it correctly, in The Road Unforeseen that I read, they are building quite remarkably, in a very war-torn area of the world, an egalitarian, communitarian, equal access for women to positions of power right there. And it's an absolute phenomenon in Rojava. And the result is that they are stopping some of the excesses of war, at least. So I would love to see a correlation between exactly when do women become more than, say, 24% of the representatives in a Congress or a parliament, and the lessening of warlike activities or the mobilization of armies by that country. I think that's just one very crude measure, but there are many other measures that could be taken. And the one that comes to mind most particularly is that Rwanda, after the genocide, and as a result of the heart-searching from the genocide, now has the largest proportion of women MPs in the world.
I was just wondering whether because you're a living example in your own party of living this and not just talking about it.
Okay, Yani, I will have something that I will share with you before even responding to the questions. But that help us also on working. One of the programs in one of the societies that we have, it is Women Studies Center, that we are working with women that they lost. It is like loser women. They lost their children, husbands and fathers, or the house that they are living in because demolition of houses and so on. So one of the this is a group of women that they draw this picture. They work all together on doing that. But what they write about it. One of the women said, "Please teach me how to unlove my children. I don't want to love them and get attached to them for fear of losing them." Other one, "It is so hard to think of the possibility that my son might lose his life by a bullet that cost only 3 shekels. Another one said,
it's humor in despair.
Yeah. "The hardest thing is to continue thinking about my son lying in a cold chamber. It is so hard for me to accept that he is freezing in a temperature of minus 70 centigrade degree." You know that some of the martyrs, they are kept in freezers, and after 2-3 months there, or sometimes more, that they release them and give them back to the family. So this is one of the things. "When my son was killed, they took him from me and didn't allow me to see him. I didn't say goodbye, nor took a last look at him. Instead, I went to his grave and broke down. I asked my daughter to bring me a digging tool to open up his grave and to see him one last time." Can you see these kind of, and there is a lot. How we can help these women to stand up again and to be strong and to feel that, okay, they lose a child, but there is another child that needs them. So because of the losing of a child, sometimes they ignore everything. They ignore themselves, they ignore their family, they ignore anything, and they keep on sadness and so on. So it is very important to empower them in order to see that still they are needed to somebody else. And the other thing, it is to help them telling their stories outside. So we organize for them different kind of presentations, conferences in different places. And here I want to say something. One of the very important things that is needed is to change the terminology that is used in the media related to war. The media is controlled, for me, I can see it, it is by Zionism. If we look at what happens in Iraq, in Syria, Iran, Afghanistan, and in Palestine, Israel is inventing the terminology and everybody is using it. Even us as Palestinians, we are using the term because they were the inventors. So we didn't think about it before. We are kept in using it. So what is needed is to think about the reflection of the terminology on our situation and to invent another terms to be used. So this is one thing. The other thing, it is many of these words that are going now, that decision is taken by the UN to support that war. If we are looking at Iraq, in support of Kuwait and in support of the Iraqi people, there was, I can say it is a third world, what we are living, it is a third world war, but it is on our land. It is done sometimes by the hands of our people, but it is supported, it is financed by US and other countries, sometimes like UK on Iraq or other countries. So, and people that are not very transparent to their countries, to their governments, to question them about what's going on. If we go back, I'm not with Saddam, but if we go back to the time of Saddam, which is better for the people of Iraq, now or before? It is totally ruined. And I think what I'm thinking of, it is that there is the imperialism does not want the Middle East to be developed and to ruin all the culture that they have. You know, the Middle East has a very rich culture and they are very proud about their culture. So to ruin that and then thinking that the new generation, they didn't have anything to be proud of. So they can be under the control of the imperialistic countries. This is one thing. And accordingly, I want some of that work to be moved to the UN itself. Decision of war against Iraq. Another decision, it is against Syria. Supporting the opposition in Syria, America is holding a war and bombing Syria. And to support the regime in of Syria, Russia is bombing the oppositions. Yeah? But at the end, Syria is ruined. And here we have to think, for what? For which interest? Are they really thinking about the Syrian people? They are thinking about their interest in that. Now Syria, they are discovering gas and petrol in there. Who will control that? So it is a you said that, Alexander, it is an economical also interest to control all the resources in that region. And of course, some of the Arabs are supporting this. But this is also why what is going on in Palestine is ignored by the other countries. Israel describes itself as the democratic state in the region. It is a very developed country. They have, of course, the nuclear weapon, and but people does not think about the people that they are controlled by Israel. They are occupied by Israel for a long time, and they are not getting their rights, and they are not questioning Israel what they are doing. When we know that there is now more than 700 children that they are under 15 years old, that they are in prison, who is questioning that? There are more than 1,000 child in Jerusalem that they are not allowed to live with their families. It is like a detention, a home detention, but it is not with their families. They are moved to another family, to another place, and they are not allowed to go to the schools. They are not allowed to talk with other children. They are not allowed to leave their homes. Who is discussing that? Who is questioning Israel what they are doing? It is something that really done in front of the eyes of everybody, but nobody is questioning that. So what I am thinking of, it is how these stories can be affecting the regime, the people that they are voting, and so on. So we have to change the societies to be more responsible as citizens to their countries. Because what I believe, of course, it's happening in the Middle East, but now we see that around 200,000 people, or even more perhaps, of the Syrian refugees are in Germany alone. Okay? So, what do you think will happen after all? Are they going to be accepted totally by the people in Germany? Are the German people allowing them to share with them their resources, their jobs, their... So, if that does not happen, what could be done? There can be a new generation of new reasons for violence in these countries, and that will be not only in one place. It can be on different places. Perhaps now Germany is thinking about working power, because now there is a decrease in the working power of German people. They think that these people can be like slaves in that country, and they can be they can accept any kind of work with low salaries. But how long that can be accepted? So I think if that problem is not solved now in that country, it will be moved, transformed to all other countries. It is not on one region. So I think it is our responsibility as people, as politicians, I see myself, and as an activist, to be responsible on talking about this. And that's why I'm here, and really thinking that, okay, with researchers, but not sometimes the researches are finished and are ended on the shelves, but how these researches can be used in mobilizing the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Zahira. I think one of the things, I don't know if Calypso would agree with me, that comes up when you talk to people who've had a lot of power is how the shock at realizing how these institutions that everyone looks up to, how vulnerable they are to the people who lead them, and how a lot of this continuity and so on that we take for granted, how fragile that is to some extent. And I mean, I think that works in both directions. Ultimately, lately there's been a lot of developments in world politics that have seemed very threatening to a lot of people. But likewise, that demonstrates also that there's no teleological direction in which, you know, this sort of Zionism or neocolonialism, that's not inevitable. I mean, that's just, you know...
to move. Yeah.
So I think that, like what you said, those testimonies that you gave that were on the back of that little paper were so powerful. I mean, in a way you can say, because the accusation is often of naivety, you know, women are naive to say this, but it's not naive to say that your world has been destroyed. In fact, it would seem more naive to say that we will be able to stop a war once we get to the casualty that we have already pre-decided, that then, you know, there's a sunk cost and we will all draw a line there, because obviously that's not how it works. I think that's so powerful. I'm wondering if, would you like to wrap up or...
Wonderful. Yeah, I know there are a couple more people who wanted to share, and I know there's a lot of experience in this room. I'm looking around to see, and Liz, it's great that you could join us, and John. But just what I did want to add on to what you've, I think my mic is still on.
Good.
So I let you. To what you've said, and to draw a bit of a thread, is that what I'm seeing is, and again, reflecting back on what both Sila and Zahira shared, is you've both worked across all the layers of power, from the very grassroots all the way up to being part, as you were, of the negotiations, and you working and negotiating and dialoguing with nuclear and political decision makers from Russia, the Soviet Union, all the way to China and the US and UK and so on. What I'm seeing emerging is women practicing, and not just women, it's like so-called ordinary people who've lost everything, being able to not just talk about and dream about, but actually live and practice a different exercise of power. In some cases, which is what I was hoping that you would speak about, which is what I've witnessed with you and people I've spoken to in your party, is how you, as a registered political party operating within a political system, chose to operate and be and collaborate, to use your term, collaborate with each other across party lines in a different way. And I think that sometimes, if I could say so, by kind of pointing to the bigger factors, it's important that we do so, but we lose the sense of agency. And I know that for me, and that's why it's been so important to work with Calypso and have this ongoing conversation that we've had over the last many years about this, is actually to see how we can think about, research on, but actually act on power in a different way. You know, and I'm struck when I see in such different parts of the world how, you know, you talked about the need for a new language, right? The very language you started off talking about, this power within and the power with each other. I mean, I heard the same redefinition of power from the slum women in Mumbai that I work with, who grew up, you know, 10 kilometers away from where I grew up in Bombay. And these women, having faced the utter lack of economic, any kind of agency, had gone through this process of deep sharing of stories and listening to each other and redefined power. And they simply say it's not about, like you said, power over and power against. It's finding our power within, our power with each other, in order to together have the power to effect change all the way up to our policymakers. And this is what we are seeing in practice over and over again. So I feel that it's just, I guess that's your point, Alexandra, as well, you know, that how can we actually be building not just reinforcing our arguments of what we are against, but actually building what we are for. You know, how much can we step into that storying of the new world that we could imagine? And what really struck me, because one of the things I've learned so much from Scylla is, I remember a few years ago you were really keen on this idea of the abolition of war itself, you know, that it simply is no longer a practice, which is very much going back to your philosophical arguments. And I was very struck. I'm on the jury of the Right Livelihood Award, which is also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize, and I don't know how much you'd agree with the fact that we gave it to Jumhuriyat, but the idea was it's one of the few journals still standing, which didn't last very long, but that was part of the idea. But actually, more and more, our jury awards have been about what is showing us the real emergence of new sources of power. But what I was struck by was that last year we gave one of the awards to a doctor, and we had a doctor in the room earlier, Rachel, who had been actually doing the surgeries, Gino Strada, an Italian who had been doing the surgeries on war-affected victims across Iraq, Afghanistan, I mean, every war. And he said, as a doctor, I do not want to have to repair broken people's bodies. I just want the war to stop, so I don't have to do what I'm doing, you know, which is exactly what I hear then with the Syrian peace activists saying, yes, it's great to get an alternative Nobel Prize and an Academy Award for saving lives, because we believe that every life we save is saving humanity. But we don't want to do that. We don't want an award to save lives. We actually want an end of war as a legitimate, as a legitimized or justified form of political action. And Gino Strada's real belief, like Scylla's, is how can I as a doctor mobilize the world to abolish the very use of war, that it simply becomes illegitimate, like slavery. Well, there's still plenty of slaves in the world, but at least the abolition of slavery, and like other forms of inhuman treatment which cannot be considered normal anymore. So I just wanted to throw that in to expand our need to create new norms. A few last...
I'll take a couple of last comments from the floor, and we're going to wrap up.
My name is John Bond. I organise a conference on human security in Switzerland and have much appreciated the contributions which some here have made to that conference. But I certainly feel that women have a different way of looking at things and is greatly needed, and also an independence of thinking. I was working with Aboriginal people in Australia, and a report had come out, this is 1997, which showed great cruelty to Aboriginal people, and the Prime Minister wanted to bury this report, and I knew this had to be heard in Parliament. And so I had to get a member of the ruling party to organise an event. And I went to various people, but the person who said, yes, I'll do it, was a woman, member of Parliament. And then the event was held, actually 2 other women from the other political parties added their names to it, and so we had an important event. I have a huge respect for Angela Merkel in opening her borders to 1 million people coming from Syria, and I can imagine the difficulty she faced and the political challenge of it, but would a man have done that? I think too of, I organised at this conference in Switzerland, one of the events is a Turkish Armenian Kurdish dialogue, and it's mostly postgraduates who are saying we've got to find a way forward, and the people who are most courageous and outspoken in it are women. I worked in Northern Ireland, and I think, you know, when you think of how the peace came in Northern Ireland, you have to have huge respect for a woman like Momolan, going where I'm not sure men would have gone, into the H block at a very tense time. But also then you look at Mary Robinson. You know, how do we heal the deep wound of the way that Ireland has been treated by Britain, by England, and her whole feeling with this wound has to be dealt with. Hate has to be healed, and the healing of hate is so crucial to ending war. And then to say, well, we must have the Queen, and the Queen must come and do these things. You know, she didn't actually apologize in words, she apologized in all the different things she did, going to, her speech at the dinner, and then going to the places of significance where Irish patriots had suffered and died, and paying her respects. That turned the feelings, and I suppose that's what I feel. Women can understand the feelings better. A friend of mine working for peace in Northern Ireland, he said to a Catholic leader once, look, what are the facts on this situation? And the Catholic leader said, look, facts are not important. He said both sides have their facts, and often they're accurate, but they take the facts that support their side, and what really counts is the feelings we have for each other. And I just feel that there is something there where women are making a huge contribution, and needs to be far more. I was at a meeting on Brexit 2 days ago, and Calypso's presentation was quite different to every other one, and to me far more stimulating as to those who want to bring some new thinking into it. And Scylla also, nuclear war, let's leave it to the politicians. Scylla says, no, let's leave it to people around our kitchen table.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we'll have one last contribution. Shall I come over there? Yes, come over here.
I work mostly with belief, really. I look at people's individual beliefs and help them to really look at what are mostly subconscious ideas about what they're capable of, what they're not capable of, how their life should look, how it can never be. And once they are able to look at their subconscious beliefs, they're actually able to reshape their life, to write a new story for themselves. And so I started a project using the same principle, looking at what is it that you could walk down any street and ask anybody about in terms of peace, and they'll give you probably two answers. One was that they would love to live in peace, but the other was that they believed it was impossible. That world peace was naive, a joke, a fantasy. And so I started to think, well, there must be something between us then, between those two, the desire for peace and the complete impossibility of it as a reality in the world. And of course it has to be our beliefs. So I started looking at creating a vehicle whereby people could start to look at not just their own beliefs about peace, but our collective beliefs about peace, which I believe are programmed into us by history, which is written with a purpose, by education, which tries to suppress our imagination of new ways in which we might live, by our mothers, by our fathers. And once we begin to do that, we can begin, I think, to take down this wall that stands now between us and the possibility on the horizon of world peace. It's literally, it's not about the fact that it's not possible. Everything is possible. The problem is we don't believe it's possible. And once we start to take down these individual beliefs and have a look at them, beliefs about, for example, heroism, what is a hero? What's the difference between a hero and a conscientious objector? Which one is a hero? Which one have we been taught is a hero? Which one could we believe is a hero? We can start to literally dismantle this wall and get a glimpse on the horizon of world peace as a possibility. And then we can bring together the desire that we have for world peace and the possibility, because it's our intent as people, which will set the direction in which we move. We never knew it was possible for us to set the intent. We were given the future. We were told what the future was. We were never asked what we wanted. Nobody actually really has any time in their life at any point to think, how would I really like to live my life? What would I really want the world to look like? So that was one thing I wanted to say. That's kind of the work that I'm doing, and I think that's...
Who are you? What's your thing?
My name is Freya Lawton. I live in Ireland at the moment. My work came out, as I say, of working with people on an individual basis and understanding how consciousness creates our reality, and giving people not just that as an idea or a thought, but actually a physical experience of it, and really people changing their lives in extremely short periods of time, literally moving their pool of possibility from tiny to enormous in moments. And realizing that if we can do that as individuals, we can certainly do that as a collective species, because we do have a single desire. We have a single desire to live in peace and harmony and empathy. And why not then? Can we bring it to fruition? But I just wanted to say something else a little bit about what we were talking about women coming together in new ways, new paradigms. A little experience that I had, not last year but the year before, in the Calais refugee camp. And I'd never been an activist before, I'd never volunteered before, but I was triggered to go and do anything that I could to help. And I remember driving towards the camp with other women who had never done anything like this either. And I was driving along the road thinking, I don't actually think I can do this. I really don't think I could do it. I was actually in tears because it was beyond my capacity to go into that camp and do anything at all. But when I actually got in there, what I discovered was an extraordinary example of a self-organizing system which had nothing to do with hierarchy at all. It was women who had taken themselves out of their comfort zone, from their homes as mothers, as teachers, as their normal lives, and said, I just cannot remain passive any longer. They didn't know what they were going to do. They weren't trained. They weren't affiliated with any organization. They just got on a train or a plane or a boat and they went there. And the women that I met there were unbelievable. And not just women, there were men too there. There were men on their knees, crying, experiencing things they'd never experienced. Sorry. But what they were able to do, it was finding something within, which they didn't know they had. And not only were they able to do extraordinary practical things, they were able to become teachers, social workers, friends, mothers to children that had no parents, no adults with them. They were able also to tell the story directly through social media in a way that no journalists were telling it, because the journalists were listening to the authority and the authority was telling them absolute lies. The authority was standing on the hill in riot gear, armed to the teeth, throwing tear gas grenades into tents where there were women and children sleeping, doing no harm, and I witnessed this. And they were telling them that there were riots going on. There were no riots. There was a lot of unrest, of course. There was a lot of fear. But what the women who had literally just turned up from their homes did was they turned around and said, we're not having this. And they became journalists. They didn't have any training, they didn't have any outlet, but they literally began to tell their own witness stories. And I think that galvanized huge numbers more people, women particularly, to join in. And it was like an organic process. Women were building, women were cooking. And I suppose what I would say from that is, I think we who have become comfortably numb in the West, comfortably numb to not just the extraordinary luxury that we have, but also our part in the destruction of huge swathes of the rest of the world, are waking up to our responsibility, and I think that is a very positive thing.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to say thank you to everyone for, I think the way that Rama put it was bringing your whole self. And I think a lot of the stories that we've heard today are witness to the fact that peace or peace building is not all mother and apple pie. And we're talking about situations of genuine violence and conflict, and people are choosing, I think, quite with open eyes to put themselves in harm's way. And even if it's, and I don't want to say just through witnessing, because I think actually witnessing is so powerful, because maybe we should say agenda setting or being visionary and really trying to expand the parameters for what's possible, and what kind of future we can build and what future we see for ourselves. So on that note, I want to thank everyone. Do you want to say
I
something?
just literally,
Yeah.
I mean, it's like the half sentence that follows what you said, where you said just witnessing, but it's not just witnessing, and very much triggered, Freya, by your powerful story, is actually the process that's emerged through the multiple conversations and inputs of Scylla and Zahira, and multiple conversations with Calypso and Alexander and so many other collaborators, Liz Carmichael, at Co with John Bond and so many of you, has led to a process which actually draws the line between what you both said. So it is that moment where the women everywhere, the women that Scylla and I know together in Somalia and northern Kenya, say, I cannot just stand and watch while the past and future is burning. And they jump forward, and it's ordinary people who do that. So it's that moment where they become active witnesses, not just observers, but witnesses with the responsibility you talk about. And then the miracle that happens is in a situation that seems impossible, like that dark space of depression that Munira had in Afghanistan, right? All of us go through thinking nothing is possible. And the miracle, which quantum science, your physics has been telling us, and which ancient philosophy says, that our consciousness creates possibilities. So we begin to envisage the actual possibilities of human potential when we put ourselves in this place where we, accept that it seemed that nothing was possible, but so much is possible, and so much self-organizes. And from that space, we can imagine, like you've done so often, what is the vision? And how can we envision it and radiate it, exactly like the stories you often share of Nelson Mandela, and how you could feel the power of his vision radiating from him, in order to do the title which Calypso had so beautifully chosen for our initiative, to enact global transformation, because what all of us see and what each person has underlined is it's together, it's this collaborative, it's across the sectors, it's when the media, together with the scholars, together with the ordinary, kids, students, housewives, preachers, etc., philosophers, our son is a philosopher, come together to do that's something that we begin to enact global transformation together. So just wanted to add that. Thank you so much, Julia, and thanks to our partners
everyone,
online as well.
Especially through our live links as well, and I hope the conversation continues. Thank you. Thank you.